I am very happy to introduce Dr. Faisal Ahmad, who's Assistant Professor of Politics at Princeton University and a National Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford. So his talk is on remitting the democratic deficit, something that he just told me has a much easier time motivating in our part of the world than he does when he's speaking to a North American audience. But his research interests and teaching interests focus on political economy and international economics more broadly. Some of his work has appeared in American Political Science Review, American Economic Journal Macroeconomics, Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization. And before joining the faculty at Princeton, he was a prize research fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford. And before academia, he actually spent a few years as an international and macroeconomist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So this is the Obama administration?
No, it was the one before that.
And the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Very happy to have Faisal here. And Faisal's actually asked me to ask you to raise questions during the talk and not wait until the end. So if anything seems unclear, just interrupt. So thank you, Faisal.
Great. Well, thank you, Nazreen, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invitation to present my work here, and thanks to Sarah for organizing all of this. So I guess I don't really have to motivate this paper as I would typically with a North American audience. So within many Muslim societies, the viability of democracy is often a quite contentious issue. So on your right here, we have a protester in Iran asking for, we want democracy. While on the left here, we have a bunch of protesters in Pakistan, I believe, saying that, no, we don't want democracy, we want Islam. And so there's this sort of tension, is Islam and democracy compatible? So this lack of democratic governance in Muslim societies is well known. I really don't have to sort of discuss that here. But this lack of democracy is something that sort of emerged in the past 30 or 40 years. So in this figure here, I'm plotting just the average level of democracy measured by the polity score. The polity score ranges from -10 to 10, where a higher value means that the country is more democratic, looking from 1960 to 2010. For a sample of non-oil producing developing countries, and I split them between Muslim and non-Muslim countries. And sort of what you want to observe is sort of like in the 1960s or so, what the typical Muslim and non-Muslim country were quite similar in terms of their level of democracy. And that pretty much sort of was the case until sort of the mid-70s. Starting then in about 1975, 1976, Muslim countries on average tend to become a little less democratic relative to non-Muslim countries. This gap sort of disappeared at the end of the Cold War and then started to increase again after the Cold War. So we sort of see the emergence of democratic deficit sort of in the mid-1970s in these non-oil producing countries. So that's where we see the emergence of it. In this paper, I'm going to argue that remittances may be a source of this increasing in level of autocracy. Again, this isn't doing the same thing again, plotting the average level of remittances as a share of GDP between Muslim and non-Muslim, non-oil producing countries. And sort of what you observe is that, typically Muslim countries on average have received higher levels of remittances, but in the mid-70s, they experienced a remittance boom relative to non-Muslim countries. And then this gap sort of converged a bit in the 2000s. So I'm going to argue that this boom here is correlated with sort of the decline in democracy that we see here. So this figure basically captures the main sort of punchline of the paper. This is plotting the average remittance differential between Muslim and non-Muslim countries over time against the average level of the polity differential. Well, the differential here, for instance, on the remittance is the average level of remittances received in a Muslim country minus a level in a non-Muslim country, where a declining level of it means that the Muslim countries on average became a little bit less democratic. So what do you observe in this? So in the period in the mid-70s up until the mid-80s or so, but the remittance differential between Muslim and non-Muslim countries increased. At the same time, Muslim countries became a little less democratic. And this tracks sort of nicely over time. As the remittance boom increases, so does the average level of autocracy in Muslim countries. So that's the main sort of empirical takeaway from this paper. The rest of the time I'm going to talk about can we causally identify this and what's the underlying mechanism. So this is obviously relevant for a country like Lebanon, sorry. Here I'm just plotting what the average level of remittances received as a share of GDP. Unfortunately, we don't have data sort of prior to 1990 during the Civil War, but it gives you a sense that probably likely during the war, with the level of external financing was quite high. And right now, about 20% of the country's GDP roughly comes in the form of remittance income. So 1 out of every $5 comes from abroad. So what do I argue in this paper? The main argument is that remittances comprise a source of non-tax revenue for governments, and this allows them to basically fund autocracy. They do so through an expenditure switching argument. So rather than money that would sort of accrue directly to a government, say, let's say in the form of foreign aid or rents coming out of natural resources and oil production, a remittance income doesn't sort of directly enter a government's revenue base. Moreover, in many countries, governments often lack the capacity and the ability to actually monitor who's receiving remittances. What I argue is sort of that governments respond to higher levels of remittances by spending a little bit less on public goods and spending more on private goods in the form of patronage jobs. So as households get a little bit richer, they might spend a fraction of that income, for instance, on better quality health care or education for their children. Governments observe this, and at the margin may decrease their expenditures on those types of welfare goods and then divert those expenditures towards goods that will sort of help them stay in power longer. This might be in the form of public sector employment or funding the military. I'm going to then provide some evidence cross-nationally that this effect tends to hold. One of the principal kind of concerns we have of sort of gauging the effect of remittances on autocracy is endogeneity. And so in this paper, I'm going to exploit a natural experiment that I used in a prior paper looking at the correlation of remittances and the price of oil. So a major source of the remittance income that Muslim countries receive comes from the Persian Gulf. Starting in the mid-70s, when the price of oil was quite high, many oil producers in the Persian Gulf started importing labor in from non-oil producing Muslim countries like Lebanon, Jordan. Later in the 70s, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and countries like that. These workers then sent that money back. Moreover, sort of the level of remittances is correlated with the distance that a country is from the Persian Gulf. And so I'm going to use the interaction of oil prices with a country's distance from Mecca as an instrumental variable for remittances. And then I'm going to use that then to gauge with the effect of remittances on measures of autocracy and also look at the composition of public spending. I'm then going to supplement this with some subnational work looking at public expenditures within the country of Jordan, looking specifically at how municipal governments will tend to expend lower effort in the collection of taxes in areas that have higher levels of migrant households. The main contributions of this paper is the first is to sort of identify that there's a time-varying democratic deficit that we observe in certain Muslim countries. And so this goes against some recent narratives that say that a lot of sort of the lack of democracy in the Muslim world that we observe is due to historical and institutional factors that predate the 1900s. The second contribution is to look at the role of public finance as a way of sort of financing autocratic governance, and looking specifically at a form of international financial flow as a means in which governments can sort of behave in this fashion. So, just in terms of a brief roadmap, I'm going to start basically with a theory and talk about the empirical strategy, spend some time looking at the cross-national evidence, and then talk about what I did in Jordan. And then I'm going to talk about some implications of this work and how we might think about how it might sort of explain contemporary dynamics in the Arab world, as well as extensions into thinking about other types of capital flows. So in terms of thinking about the sources of the democratic deficit, one strand of work argues that it's due to basically time invariant factors. So one strand of this is looking at the role of culture and religion. scholars such as Bernard Lewis, for instance, argues that the lack of democracy in Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East, stems from the region's history of what he calls unrelieved autocracy that stems back to the 9th century. Fish has argued that gender relations sort of proxy institutional characteristics of these societies that sort of makes them less amenable for democracy. He looks at sort of the role of women's rights and how that is correlated with a lack of democracy. For others, it's not religion per se that sort of explains what the lack of democracy, but the long-run influence of control structures developed under pre-modern Islamic institutions. So Eric Cheney, he's an economic historian, argues, for instance, that slave armies during the expansion of the Islamic Empire after the death of the Prophet concentrated power in the rule of military rulers at the expense of the commercial class. And over time, these power dynamics were institutionalized in sort of, and have persisted ever since. So in support of this conjecture, for instance, he shows that the percentage of a country's landmass that was conquered by Arab armies following the death of the Prophet, which he uses as a proxy of pre-modern control structures, accounts for the democratic deficit that we observe today. Now, the main concern with these types of strategies is that it can only sort of explain the cross-sectional variation that we observe between Muslim and non-Muslim countries. It can't sort of explain the within-country variation in the levels of democracy that we observe in many Muslim countries. So sort of like as the second slide that I showed you, we do sort of see movements in autocracy in these Muslim societies. And so these explanations that sort of argue that there's a long-run influence of religion or institutions can't really explain that within-country variation. Some scholars have looked at sort of various sort of time-varying characteristics. One such role is the role of geopolitics and the role of nationalism sort of as fostering ways in which governments in the region have been able to sort of stay in power longer through autocratic means, but the other sort of looked at the role of the U.S. in sort of propping up certain types of regimes and providing either diplomatic cover for them or foreign assistance, either directly through foreign aid or through IMF packages that might bail out countries during crisis. Another series of work has sort of looked at the role of unearned income. And so some of this is, for instance, Michael Ross's work looking at the role of natural resources, primarily oil production, in sustaining authoritarian institutions in oil-producing countries. And so this is consistent with sort of the oil curse literature, right? Governments that have high sources of non-tax income are able to sort of stave off concessions in the form of democratic governance. I've done some work previously that sort of looks at foreign aid as a form of non-tax income that sort of generates the same types of non-democratic institutions, precisely because it's a form of non-tax or unearned income that a government has that it can sort of fund and sustain authoritarian governance. So given these explanations, then how do governments sort of stay in power in general? And so there's two features of it. The first is the role of revenue in sustaining any type of government. And if you think broadly between both democratic governments and authoritarian governments, they have basically two instruments that they can stay in power with. They can use repression, or they can accumulate loyalty. And loyalty can differ in the different contexts. So in countries that are less democratic, loyalty may be sort of providing public sector jobs to supporters of the regime, buying off the military. In democracies, some form of loyalty is also patronage job for supporters, but also providing public goods for the masses as able to sort of win their electoral support. So given that sort of revenues matter for how governments stay in power, what other types of ways that they can raise it? Basically, they can do either through taxation or non-taxation. Governments that rely more on non-tax revenue tend to have less need of being democratically accountable. So starting from the work of like Tilly, for instance, has talked about sort of how governments that require, that have to collect their revenues through taxation have to grant policy concessions to whom they're collecting taxes from. And this sort of explains why many European states move towards democratic governance when the state have to collect taxes to raise armies. As this sort of applies to unearned income, governments that sort of generate their money from non-tax sources, such as oil rents, for instance, don't actually have to make these policy concessions, and as a result, don't have to make these democratic policy concessions at all. All right, so given that revenues matter, how do they sort of differ between the types of governments that we have? So when you think about sort of the broad political economy of government finance. So the first sort of starting point is, as you think about when governments sort of make a transition from authoritarian regime to a democratic regime, the work of Asimov and Robinson sort of argues that democracy represents a commitment to future redistribution. So as a result, in equilibrium, then we should observe that democratic governments will spend a larger fraction of their government budgets on welfare goods that benefit the masses. But within political science, there's work looking at the role of the selectorate size, looking at sort of who is the relevant group within society that chooses the leader, and sort of what is the form of payment that those leaders then make to sort of win their support. The main finding from this is as the selectorate size increases, as the government becomes more democratic, it has to buy out more voters, and that will then sort of shift their distribution of their expenditures towards public goods. In equilibrium then, so we should observe that autocratic governments, which have a smaller selectorate, will spend a larger share of their government budgets on patronage as well as repression. And that if they have access to free resources, forms of non-tax income, such as foreign aid or oil, this will allow them to spend a greater share of their expenditures on things like patronage. So do we actually observe this? What's interesting about remittances is that it's not income that's directly received by governments, right? This is income that's received by households. There's been some work looking, for instance, how many developing countries often lack the resources to effectively monitor taxes. So we can kind of think of it as being a potential form of non-tax income, but we have to think about how they would integrate that into their revenue base. So is there actually a correlation between autocracy and patronage? So measuring patronage is a pretty tricky thing to do. We could look at things like corruption, but even then measuring corruption is hard. So one proxy that we can look at is let's look at the size of the public sector. But the share of government expenditures that is pays on public salaries and a number of jobs. And so what this graph here is plotting the average level of public sector compensation as a share of total government expenditures as the countries become less democratic to more democratic. And so what we observe is that countries that are more authoritarian tend to spend a larger share of their public budgets on public sector employment. Lebanon is right here, so it's not so bad. At least it's below the line, so that's a good thing. But in general, sort of like as governments become more authoritarian, it will spend a larger fraction of its budget on public sector employment. What about sort of the provision of welfare goods? So one sort of catch-all measure of government welfare would be sort of the total share of payments it makes in the form of welfare payments, things like Social Security, healthcare, and things like that. And so here we're plotting the average share that a government has of its welfare against countries that are less and more democratic. And what we observe is that countries that are more democratic, a government will spend a larger share of its budget on public goods. So it's definitely sort of consistent sort of with what we observe in the cross-section of countries. All right, so then how might remittances actually finance autocracy? Obviously, this is money that's not directly received by government, so how might they sort of expend it? So one way to think about it is how it might sort of change the composition of government finances. But there's been some work looking at how this might happen. Both of these papers sort of develop formal models that sort of establish this, but the general gist of it is that governments can spend on two types of goods. Private government consumption, which is patronage, or public government consumption, which is welfare goods. Remittances finance, as households get a little bit more money from remittances, a household might then spend some fraction of that on certain types of substitutable welfare goods, things like healthcare, education. Governments observe this, and as a result, they will decrease their own expenditures on those types of public goods, and then divert those expenditures towards patronage. Moreover, given their sort of institutional characteristics, governments that are in more authoritarian political institutional settings are more likely to engage in this switching behavior. They're rewarded by engaging in patronage more so than providing public goods. But rather than sort of changing the composition of government finances, we can imagine that remittances might actually change the level of total government spending. The argument here is sort of that as a country receives high levels of aggregate remittances, it makes it much easier for them to borrow money on the sovereign debt market. And this will sort of expand the total level of government spending. So given that, then a government can just spend more on patronage as well as potentially more on welfare. In equilibrium, then we might sort of just observe them being able to stay in power much longer. Yeah?
Just to be clear, are patronage and welfare good mutually exclusive? Well-defined categories?
So from a theoretical standpoint, we can sort of do that. Empirically, it's much harder to do, right? So public sector employment, you know, on the one hand, you can sort of argue that some component of it is actually a welfare good, but a lot of it also is politically motivated. Now, what I showed you here is that countries that tend to be less democratic, governments will just spend a lot more and will have much bigger public sectors in general. And sort of the finding in the literature there is that a lot of those jobs are actually jobs that sort of reward supporters of the regime.
Because I'm thinking about Lebanon, and a lot of politicians have their own hospitals and have their own, it's patronage, but it's also offering welfare, basic welfare.
Yeah, so, but I mean, yes, that's true. So for me, but if you were going to compare, but the reason that we observe that in Lebanon and say a similar country that might be more democratic, we probably observe politicians engaging in less of that type of behavior. And so, yeah, I agree that it's a sort of tricky thing to get at. I'm going to provide some additional results that get at other types of sort of welfare goods provision, as healthcare, immunizations to measles and stuff that sort of might better capture that. But like I said, this is conceptually a difficult thing to do. I've looked at things like corruption. So in a previous paper, I looked at the effect of remittances on patronage-based corruption based on corruption perception scores. And we see the same basic finding there, that remittances lead to higher levels of corruption. Okay, so this is how remittances can potentially lead to higher levels of autocracy. But we can imagine that remittances may actually weaken authoritarian governments. The first sort of potential mechanism is through modernization effects. That as income rises, there just may be greater demands by the public for political liberalization and movements towards democracy. Also, as sort of households get more money, this might sort of change their preferences for political participation. On the one hand, you can imagine that it might just lead to high levels of political mobilization. Yet there's been some research looking at in Latin America, that shows that migrant households are more likely to sort of withdraw from the political process. Mainly because they're able to sort of provide many of the public goods that they would kind of expect from a government, and no longer having that expectation, they may just sort of be less politically interested. Recent research suggests that in party-based dictatorships, which require elections to stay in power, high levels of remittances makes it more costly for those political parties to buy the electoral support. So in party-based dictatorships, higher levels of remittances weaken patronage and makes it more likely for those governments to lose power. This argument sort of is less applicable to many of the Muslim societies in this paper, probably because they're not party dictatorships. Okay, so given that remittances might affect politics, how can we sort of go about estimating this type of effect? So I'm motivated to talk with a bunch of trends that sort of show that there's a correlation. But obviously I'm not controlling for other factors that might affect both the level of remittances received by a country as well as the level of democracy. So if we were going to just run a basic regression, we would regress autocracy on with the level of remittances received in country I in year T, a vector of covariance given by xit, which could be things like log GDP, what the average income of the country, the growth rate, the population size, as well as sort of institutional characteristics of that country. Now, sort of the main problem with running a regression in this form is obviously endogeneity bias. So there's sort of two sources of bias here. One is just reverse causality. So countries that tend to be authoritarian have inferior socioeconomic conditions that are more conducive for immigration, and as a result, those countries may have higher levels of remittances. Moreover, it's not uncommon that many of these leaders also have incentives to sort of send migrants abroad. So in the Philippines, for instance, Marcos had an active policy where he sort of encouraged the outward migration of dissidents out of the country, which sort of was a way of sort of relieving pressure against the regime, as well as providing a source of external finance that the government was able to do. So with the existence of reverse causality, though, will sort of upward bias the estimate of beta on autocracy. The other form of endogeneity is in the form of measurement error. Many authoritarian countries lack the sort of monitoring capabilities to actually track this. As a result, then they'll have sort of mismeasured values of their remittance income. If we want to less regression on this will tend to attenuate the effect of beta on autocracy, and so this will downward bias the estimate. So one solution to this is to use an instrumental variable. So just to sort of recap what an instrument does, suppose that we have an instrument that we call Z, and our potentially endogenous variable here is remittances. The idea is to use some plausibly exogenous variation in Z to predict some of the variation in remittances, and then use that then to gauge the effect of remittances on autocracy. The other sort of assumption that we make within in the IV is that the instrument ZIT is uncorrelated with our underlying measure of autocracy. And sort of you guys can provide feedback on whether or not you actually buy what they call the exclusion restriction here. So what do I use as the instrument? Yes?
So this is just a small point. So why are the concerns, why do you only just reverse causality measurement error? Why is the method variable bias not an issue here?
Oh, that's also an issue as well.
But just one of the bigger, because you can't claim remittances are randomly assigned.
They're not yet. So I'm going to have country fixed effects. I'll account for some of those. But yeah, and so I'm going to control for other factors that we think will be correlated both with remittances and with autocracy. So my instrument here is I'm going to use two basic components. One, I'm going to use the oil prices to look at the time-varying component of remittances received in these countries. And the second is that I'm going to use a cross-sectional variation, namely that countries that are closer to Mecca, which is approximately for distance to the Persian Gulf, tend to receive on average higher levels of remittance income. And this is precisely to pick up sort of the fixed cost of migration that's required to sort of emigrate abroad. So this is just looking at sort of the time-varying component of the instrument. So here I'm plotting the from 1972 to 2008, the price of oil, here given by the dotted line, and the average level of remittances received in the Muslim country, non-economy. So what you will sort of observe is that it is positively correlated. So when the price of oil is high, these countries in general tend to receive higher levels of remittances, and we can sort of observe this in the period of the mid-70s when the price of oil shot up. A year later or so, sort of the resulting remittance flows back to their home country. As the price fell in the mid-80s to the early 90s, sort of the average level of remittances, and the relationship here starts to break down a little bit, precisely because the sources of remittance income in Muslim countries has changed over time. Increasingly, what they get a little bit less of their income from the Persian Gulf and get it from other sources. So that's the time-varying component. What about the cross-sectional component? So I'm going to use the distance of Mecca to sort of proxy as the fixed cost of migration. Using distance sort of fixed improves the precision of the instrumental variable, lowers the standard errors and makes the instrument more powerful. And we sort of observe this in the data. So countries that are less than 1,000 miles away from Mecca, Eritrea, Sudan, Djibouti, Jordan, Lebanon, for instance, on average receive remittances of about 9 percentage points of GDP. As you move farther away to countries that are between 1,000 to 2,000 miles, Turkey, Morocco, and Somalia, the level of remittances also falls. And for countries more than 2,000 miles away, Pakistan, Mali, Bangladesh, Senegal, what the level of remittance also declines. More we also notice that the average quality score also declines. So as you get further away from the Gulf, the level of democracy also tends to decrease. So I'm going to use the interaction of the price of oil and countries' distance from Mecca as an instrumental variable. So here's just looking at the first stage and the second stage progression. In the first stage, I reverse remittances on the price of oil interacting with the country's distance from Mecca. I control for a vector of time-varying covariance. I control for the country fixed effect, which will subsume the main effect coming out of distance, but will also account for many of the institutional characteristics that we sort of think might affect the lack of democracy. So things like what the role of history, the role of religion, and things like that. DT is fixed effects that will subsume the main effect coming out of the oil prices. I then use that first stage in the second stage, so I predict the average with the particular level of remittances, and then reverse that on the measure of autocracy. I control for a standard set of covariance, so the level of income, log GDP per capita. So countries that tend to be higher income tend to be more democratic, with the level of growth, the population size, foreign aid. So during the 1970s, when the price of oil was high, many Gulf oil producers also sent a lot of foreign aid money, and foreign aid may also have an independent effect on the level of autocracy, so I control for that. I also control for a measure of political instability with a dummy variable for civil war. All the data is publicly available, so I use my politics data primarily from Polity, the economic data from the World Bank, the World Development Indicators, and PRIO for the conflict data. My sample period is 1972 to 2009. In terms of gauging with the effect of beta, this will be the average treatment effect for a set of Muslim non-oil producing countries that tend to be authoritarian over time. Moreover, if we think about the underlying research design, I'm basically comparing Muslim to non-Muslim countries over time, where Muslim countries are my treatment groups, since they're the ones receiving this oil price shock, versus sort of the control group of non-Muslim countries. Prior to the start, yes?
Yeah, so just a question, maybe looking at
Yeah.
initials, but this also requires that any time-varying factors that you have across any of these countries is going to be uncorrelated to your instrument is able to absorb all of this, right? At the end of the day, controlling for XIT.
Yeah. So the year fixed effect will sort of account for those like common for those common shocks, right? Now we might think that there might be some shocks that are like specifically unique to. Well, I don't do country-specific time trends here, not in this paper, but there might be sort of like region-specific time trends as well as sort of like maybe Muslim countries are more exposed to certain types of things over time, the role of Islamization or something. So I try to control for those things in some of the robustness checks, and I'll get to that. Anyways, so just going back to sort of thinking about the research design, so I'm basically comparing Muslim to non-Muslim countries over time. Prior to sort of the treatment period of the 1970s, these countries were quite similar on a variety of observable characteristics. So the level of economic development was quite similar in the late 1960s. Moreover, sort of the average level of quality was similar, as well as the levels of instability and things like that. So these groups were broadly similar prior to the treatment period. Okay. So how do I measure my main dependent variable? So I'm going to measure autocracy on basically two indices. The main one is the Executive Constraints Index from Polity. Some scholarship has sort of identified that this is sort of the main driver of movements in the Polity Index over time. That countries become less democratic precisely more often than not when their leaders become more powerful. So with the executive constraints variable ranges from 1 to 7, where a lower score means that the government, where the leader has fewer constraints on their power, so it's a measure of how authoritarian that is. And we sort of observe that in the average level of the polity score, for instance, in the sample. So governments that have leaders that have unlimited power, their overall like polity score is -7. Countries that are where the executive has parity with other institutions in the society, such as the legislature or the judiciary, also tends to be more democratic. More of this is also correlated with sort of how long they stay in power, right? So, you know, the least constrained dictator on average spends about 12 years in office, while sort of a democratic leader on average will spend about 4 years in office. So this is broadly sort of consistent with what we think about autocracy and democracy and survival of leaders. Okay, so these are the two main indicators I'm going to use to measure my level of autocracy. So let me first of all just present the baseline sort of OLS results. It sort of confirms the sort of main trends I showed you in the first couple of slides. So columns 1 and 2 just look at the executive constraints index, where I just sort of split the sample up between Muslim and non-Muslim. So in column 1, for instance, it shows that you know, a 1 percentage point increase in remittances as a share of GDP decreases the executive constraint index by about 10 points, by about 0.1 of an index point. On average, you know, remittances were about 8 to 10% of GDP over the for many countries, so that represents about a 1 index point decrease in poverty score. If we do the same thing in non-Muslim countries, we see no effect. In columns 3 and 4, I look at the catch-all sort of like poverty index, and we see that higher levels of remittances in Muslim countries lowers their poverty score, and we see no effect in non-Muslim countries. So these, I think, results sort of like corroborate the main sort of trends that I showed you in the first few slides. Here the results are sort of controlling for log GDP per capita and all those things. Here are the main results of the paper, looking at the effect of instrumented remittances on executive constraints and poverty. So just looking at panel B first, which is just the first stage regression. Column 1 shows you that with a coefficient here of 0.024, for instance, means that for the typical non-oil producing Muslim country, who's about 2,000 miles away from Mecca, a $10 increase in the price of oil increases their level of remittances by about half a percentage point of GDP. Over the sample period, the price of oil fluctuated from a price of, that's right, $17 a barrel at the minimum to a high of $97. And so this represents a shock to GDP of remittances of about 4 percentage points of GDP. The second thing to note is that the instrument is quite powerful. The F statistic on the sort of instrument is above the threshold of 10, which is typically used in this case. So I now use this sort of predicted level of remittances in the first stage, looking at the effect of remittances on executive constraints. And we see here that remittances lower with the level of executive constraints. Moreover, what the estimate here is much larger than the OLS estimate, which suggests that the instrument sort of adjusts for sort of the attenuation bias coming out of the measurement error. In column 2, I look at the level, rather than looking at the share of remittances as a share of GDP, I look at the level of total remittance income. And again, sort of like countries that receive higher levels of aggregate remittances, on average, their executive constraints also falls. Columns 3 and 4 look at the same thing for the poverty index again. So instrumental remittances lower the level of the poverty score in these countries. Okay, so what are some of the robustness checks that I do? So one concern that we might have is that but these measures of institutions are quite sticky. They're not changing that much over time. So one way that we can sort of account for this persistence is to use a lag-dependent variable. And in specifications, when I do that, the results still hold. The results also hold in specifications that vary the level of fixed effects. They also hold when I sort of exclude certain countries that we might think are potentially problematic, that receive high levels of remittance income, Jordan, Lebanon, the high levels, the results still hold. We might think that there's other variables that are correlated with the price of oil that might affect political dynamics in these countries, independent of the remittance channel. The results hold when I control for the level of inflation, as well as trade, since all of these countries are oil importers, as well as the net migration of these countries. And so I think this last concern will probably get to your last questions. So there's obviously a concern that there might be sort of these unobserved trends that are affecting Muslim countries, or countries in general overall, that may be driving some of this. So the first concern is maybe there's the role of the Cold War is affecting it. As you sort of know, like in the data, after the Cold War, many countries democratized. And it's quite possible that the Cold War had differential effects in Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So one way to sort of account for this is to include a dummy where I have a Cold War interactor with a Muslim interaction to sort of see if there's any differential effect of the Cold War. When I do that, the results still hold. Another concern that we might have is that there might be sort of this unobserved Islamization effect that's going on in these countries. That maybe there's a spread of like Wahhabism and that sort of version of Islam that's sort of making these societies more conservative and more authoritarian. So one way to sort of control for this is to use an interaction of a year trend with a Muslim dummy to see whether or not this unobserved sort of effect is having a differential effect in Muslim societies. When I do that, the results still hold. Okay, so hopefully I've provided some evidence that there's a causal effect of remittances on democracy in these countries. Does this operate through this public expenditure switching argument? So this table here is just looking at the effect of remittances on the level of government employee compensation as a share of its total government expenditures in column 1. And then looking at also the measure of subsidies and transfers, this measure of welfare payments as a share of government expenditures. So what you observe in column 1A is that when countries receive higher levels of remittances, a government will spend a larger share of its budget on government employment compensation, and this occurs while they also decrease their expenditures on welfare. So it's broadly consistent with this sort of welfare expenditure switching argument. In column 5 here, I just look at a specific measure of a welfare good that we can think of, immunization to measles. This is a pretty good measure because it's available over a much longer time frame. And what we observe here is that countries that receive high levels of remittances, a government there'll be lower levels of immunization to these types of diseases. In the paper, I also provide evidence that remittances decrease tax effort. So this gets at the underlying assumption that governments are unable to sort of integrate remittances directly into their revenue base through taxation. But the coefficient on this variable is negative and significant. Sort of another underlying assumption in the model is that remittances increase household expenditures, and we observe that directly as well. What about sort of the other mechanisms? So the first is sort of, rather than changing the composition of government finances, remittances might just increase the total size of government spending. And I'm happy to talk about these results and actually discuss them a bit more in detail in the Q&A. But there's sort of weak evidence that remittances affect the level of government spending. To measure this, I use a country's access to foreign capital, looking at their net capital balance. And the results here show that remittances have a small positive but insignificant effect on their foreign borrowing. Moreover, there's no effect on government expenditure, so it doesn't sort of increase the size of government spending in all of these countries. Okay, so then looking at sort of like the ways in which you might think that remittances might weaken autocracy, there's very sort of weak evidence of that. So there's no evidence that remittances have a significant effect in increasing the GDP per capita in these countries. Moreover, it also tends to lower the rates of economic growth. So it's not consistent with sort of the modernization effect that we might observe. With respect to political discontent, I look at sort of measures of that. I look at the number of riots as well as anti-government demonstrations. In general, remittances have a positive effect on these things, but they're not significant in any way. And then the last thing is looking at just vote share in countries that actually hold elections. Here, remittances have a positive but statistically insignificant effect on the vote share of the incumbent. So in general, the channels in which we might think that remittances undermine autocracy doesn't seem to be operating in these countries. It seems to be operating through this expenditure switching argument. Okay, so but how can I sort of unpack this underlying mechanism a bit more? So for this, I wanted to get some data on public spending in one of these countries. And so this week I've been talking to people here trying to get a sense of whether or not this data is available in Lebanon. And the short answer is it might be, but it's extremely difficult to do. Fortunately, this data is available, but not so easy to get in Jordan, but it's available. So there's two sources of data that I use for this. The first is looking the 2009-2010 Cities and Villages Development Bank and Municipal Affairs, what they release data on the public finances at the municipal level in Jordan. And there are 93 municipalities. I then leverage that with data that I get from the 2010 labor market survey that asks questions about the share, whether or not a household receives remittances and the actual level of remittances. I'm then able to sort of identify which municipalities that those individuals are and then map that to with the municipal level public finance data. My measure of public goods effort or distribution in this case is I'm going to look at the level of self-collected taxes. And so there's been research, particularly in Africa, looking at how whether a government expends the effort to collect taxes is a proxy of their willingness to provide local public goods. And so when a government provides less, collects less in taxes, it's an indication that it's expending less effort in the provision of public goods. This table here just summarizes some of the main controls that I have in the data. So there's 93 municipalities, on average about, for the typical municipality, about 5% of households receive remittance income. I control for things like the unemployment rate, the poverty population, as well as the grants that's given, that's transferred from the central government to these municipal governments. So here are the main results coming out of the subnational data from Jordan. So columns 1 and 2 just look at the effect of, so column 1 looks at the share of migrant households in each municipality. Municipalities that have a higher level of migrant households, but there seems to be less collection of self-collected taxes as a share of total government revenue. The results are slightly stronger when I use the level of remittances. One of the increasing features of, one of the nice things about Jordan is that at the municipal level they allow elections. And so this electoral competition may sort of induce candidates and governments to provide more or less public goods. And a lot of this competition involves tribal mobilizations. So in columns 3 and 4, I control for a measure of tribal mobilizations, particularly with the number of groups that participated in the previous election, and when I do so, the results still hold, and if not, they're slightly stronger than they were in regressions that exclude them in columns 1 and 2. So I think this analysis here, I think, is suggestive of this sort of substitution effect, at least at the subnational level, that at the local level, municipal governments in which there's a higher fraction of households that receive remittance income are more likely to sort of exert less effort in the provision of public goods, here measured by with their willingness to collect taxes. Okay, so let me just sort of summarize the main takeaways of this paper. I hope, first of all, that I sort of showed you some evidence that this democratic deficit varies for at least a subset of Muslim countries, particularly those that don't produce any oil, or very low amounts of oil. That this seems to be correlated, if not caused, by remittance income, and that it seems to occur through this substitution effect. The government will spend a little bit less on public goods and divert those expenditures on patronage, and that sort of allows them to sort of maintain their authoritarian institutions. Okay, so let me just talk about some implications of this research. The first is that it might give us some insights into understanding political uncertainty and upheaval during the Arab Spring. The second is that it sort of frames remittances as a form of exporting the resource first. So I've done some work looking at the role of foreign aid, and this paper sort of establishes that remittances that emerged out of the oil price shocks of the 1970s can also account for some of the lack of democracy that we see in Muslim societies. And then the third implication is, just thinking more broadly, is why have Muslim countries sort of missed the third wave of democratization relative to other countries around the world? And so I'll provide some like graphs of that and a paper that I'm currently working on that tries to understand the underlying theory behind it. Okay. So if you buy my argument that remittances are correlated with the level of autocracy, this might give us some insights into understanding why Egypt was sort of more vulnerable to political upheaval on the eve of the Arab Spring relative to, say, a country like Jordan. So here I'm just plotting the level, the average, what the level of foreign aid received in Egypt and the level of remittances from the 1980 until on the eve of the Arab Spring, as well as the level of executive constraints. So the constraints for President Mubarak was about 3. And what you sort of observe is that, you know, at the end of the Cold War, after the first Gulf War, the level of aid and remittances were quite high in Egypt. And then by the sort of late 2000s, it had declined. Foreign aid had dropped to about 1 percentage point of GDP, and remittance income had dropped to about 4 or 5% of GDP. Now you contrast that with a country like Jordan, who by the time of the eve of the Arab Spring also had an executive constraints index of about 3. So this country has sort of increasingly sort of like democratized, well, I won't say democratized, but the king has sort of given up some powers, and his level of executive constraints was about the same level as Egypt. Now you contrast that with their level of sort of foreign aid and remittances, where you see that, you know, aid was also high, but only about 4 percentage points of GDP. In contrast, their level of remittances are about 20% of GDP. So if you think that sort of remittances are sort of allowing regimes to sort of maintain their authoritarian structures, Jordan had higher levels of remittance income relative to Egypt and sort of made that country sort of less susceptible to sort of the political upheaval that we observe. The other sort of thing that I want to talk about is that there might be also a correlation between thinking about aid and remittance as a form of exporting the resource curves. So another way of thinking about politics in these countries is looking at the level of instability or civil war. So here I'm just plotting, again, for the same subsample of non-oil producing Muslim countries, the average propensity of civil war. But the green line here is looking at major civil wars where you have at least 1,000 battle deaths per year. And the red line here is looking at sort of minor civil war, conflict with at least 25 battle deaths a year. And sort of what you see is that during the, from the 60s until like the mid-70s, until the early 80s, the level of conflict was quite low. But then it picked up a lot in the late 80s, early 90s, and then sort of subsided. Moreover, there seems to be a correlation between the price of oil. So when the price of oil was quite high in the mid-70s to early 80s, the levels of stability in these countries was quite high, right? But they were less predisposed to having conflict. As the price of oil fell, these countries became more unstable, indicated by higher levels of conflict. So in this, moreover, at this time, these countries were receiving different levels of foreign aid. In the 60s or so, the typical Muslim and non-Muslim country received about the same level of foreign aid as a share of GDP. But then in the mid-70s, when the price of oil was high, Arab donors became increasingly generous with their foreign aid. And so many of these countries received a huge increase in their foreign aid receipts. And we don't see the same sort of increase happening for non-Muslim countries. In the mid-80s, as the price of oil started to fall, so did the average level of aid into these countries. So there might be a correlation now between foreign aid and conflict, and that's sort of what we observe here. So I'm doing the same thing that I did at the beginning of the talk. Here I'm just looking at the aid differential between Muslim and non-Muslim countries over time, here given by the dotted line, and here looking at the civil war differential. So what does this graph show? That when the aid differential was high, in this period here, for instance, mid-70s to the mid-80s, the average level of conflict was much lower. But then when the aid differential fell, so did the level of conflict in these societies increased. And so if you look at sort of what the differences between this, for instance, it's significant. And this is something that I've established in a earlier paper, and I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. Okay. So this is a new project that I'm working on, so I'd like to get your thoughts on this more broadly. So one of these sort of puzzles that I've always thought about is why sort of have Muslim countries missed this sort of third wave of democratization. So as I should have showed you at the beginning of the presentation, in the late 60s or so, the typical Muslim and non-Muslim countries didn't differ that much in their levels of autocracy. But then sort of starting in the 70s and then more so now, we see a widening gap of differences in democracy. Yeah, what's interesting is that if you look at these countries, in the mid-70s or so, these countries became increasingly authoritarian, precisely because the oil shocks had differential effects. So the oil price shocks in the 70s led to a lot of petrodollar recycling in the form of commercial loans. A lot of that went to Latin American countries that sort of sustained their dictatorships. In the mid-80s or so, many of these countries faced debt crisis precisely because the price of oil fell and they lost access to that external revenue. This is exactly when these countries started to democratize. In Muslim countries, we see the same thing, but operating mostly through the foreign aid channel. And the last thing is sort of like within Eastern European countries, especially the Eastern Bloc, the price of oil also sort of mattered there. But it didn't operate through the Gulf donors, it operated through the Soviet Union. So all sort of, the Soviets during the Cold War subsidized their sort of satellites through the transfers payments. And this came primarily through their ability to export oil, but on using different oil prices. And they sort of did this, rather than sort of giving them money, they did this through trade concessions. And so countries were able to sort of use these subsidies to engage in trade between these countries. When the price of oil fell in the mid-80s, that's when the Soviet regime started to sort of collapse. And then following that, that's when we sort of see these countries democratize. So we sort of see, here we're looking Muslim countries here in red. After the Cold War, they sort of languished. But both Latin America and Eastern Europe democratized. So the question is why did they do that and not the other countries? So I've already showed you sort of there's a strong correlation between oil prices and foreign aid in Muslim countries. For Latin America, the correlation between sort of how the resource cost was transferred abroad was through petrodollar recycling, primarily in the form of commercial loans. And here we're just looking at the average level of commercial loans as a share of GDP in these countries. And what you sort of see is that when the price of oil was quite high, that's when they received higher levels of external financing through the form of that. And when the price came down, that's when it declined. And this is exactly when these countries started to democratize. With the Eastern European countries, it's slightly harder to get because we don't have data for a lot of these countries. But we also see sort of similar trends. When the price of oil was high, they were able to trade more with each other, consistent with sort of how the Soviets sort of maintained their system of transfers between the Eastern Bloc societies. When the price of oil fell, so did the exports between these countries. And so what I do in a paper with Daniel Schwab and Eric Worker is that we're trying to develop a model that sort of explains this. So Besley and Pearson have a series of papers that looks at the effect of like non-tax income on state capacity and conflict. And what they basically sort of argue is that it's increasing. So countries that have higher levels of unearned income and that tend to be more authoritarian become more unstable and are more prone to civil war. What we do in our paper is that we sort of tweak that model and find the conditions under which we might sort of see declines in aid leading to democratization in certain contexts, in this case Eastern Europe and Latin America, while in other contexts it might lead to higher levels of conflict. Okay, so let me just sort of end my talk here by thinking just more broadly about how we think about rents and politics in general. So the first thing I want to take away is that government revenues matter for how governments basically are able to function. And this is a function of both their tax and non-tax income. Governments that have higher amounts of non-tax income may be able to engage in policies that are anti-democratic. The next sort of takeaway, I think, is that the resource curse can be exploited, and that external transfers can fund autocracy. In this paper, I've talked about remittances as being one form of that external financing, but we can also think of other ways: foreign aid, commercial lending, and subsidized trade between countries. So in future work, I plan to look at the sort of, does all this sort of work sort of at the subnational level? It'd be great to hear your thoughts about whether or not you think this can be done in Lebanon, as well as sort of increasingly how many of these autocracies are sort of adopting some sort of democratic institutions in the form of elections. So I'd be curious to see how you think about how foreign aid and remittances affect electoral strategies of incumbent parties. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for that. So we want to open it up to questions, comments, if people have them.
Yeah.
So this is not my literature, but I'm just going to go back a bit to the econometrics part.
Yes.
So I'm actually, sorry, I don't have the topic of your paper right now, but I was just wondering, so you have that regression at some point where you have the IV estimates and the reduced form estimates, and you have them with controls. Do your estimates change much when you add controls, you don't add controls? Do you have...
Look at the appendix.
Yeah, because...
I have those data results. I don't know the top of my head. Let me see.
Because I mean, depending on how far you want to push the causal angle, it's going to...
Give me a second. Yeah, so the causal estimates don't change. So there I showed you sort of the estimate here was like a negative 0.6. Without the covariates, it drops to a negative 0.54. So not a big drop. So yeah.
If we go back to the table on self-collected taxes in Jordan, do you worry that municipalities that have a higher share of migrant households are better off for other reasons as well? So higher education or levels, and that's why they're migrating, or I don't know, some other. So
Yeah, so I'm controlling for things like poverty rate. I mean, I can control for education. I can use a survey data to get some sort of measure at the municipal level of education. I haven't done that here, but I imagine I could do that.
So I mean, are you able to control for something representing the average, socioeconomic status of a household in that locality? So I mean, so the worry is maybe this is not remittances. Maybe this is, other aspects of wealthier communities.
Right. So I'm able to sort of control for the poverty rate within, so that gets at the municipal level, unemployment rate. So these will get at those. I mean, I could use a survey data to back out, get some sort of measure, average income or something like that. It's doable. I haven't done that yet, but that's definitely doable.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you would describe the quasi-natural experiment part? Like, what is it that changes in the 70s that you think allows you to have that?
Yeah, so the source of variation here is the oil prices, which I'm taking as, so the sample is my estimating sample is to non-oil producing countries, right? And so I'm using the fact that oil prices are driven by exogenous factors, primarily a supply side shock that's occurring in the 70s. So I'm using that source of plausible exogeneity of oil prices that's my source of like plausible exogeneity coming off the instrument. And then I'm interacting it with something that's potentially endogenous here with the distance, but sort of like I'm controlling for it with the country fixed effect as well as sort of like specifications that just have sort of the distance to, so my within country variation is coming off the oil prices conditioned on the distance, right? And so the way that I view distance is sort of, it's a way in which the shock is sort of propagated differently to different countries. Basically, countries that are closer experience the shock much larger.
And the results are robust to other periods? Like, so one worry is that the price shock of the 70s is very much politically motivated and therefore may also affect aid, but also affect, the sense of solidarity across a wider spread of countries at the time. This was very much a conscious retaliation for a conflict at the time, right? A regional conflict at the time. So something about intra-Muslim relationships between oil-producing and non-oil-producing countries may have been quite special at that particular juncture. So do you still get, so if you sort of abstract from these two crazy oil shocks of the 70s, would you still, in the later period where oil prices are less, are more sort of world demand, world supply, do you still get the results that you get?
So not when I look at or talk, so I haven't done it for this, in the case of this paper. Now in my 2013 paper, I look at the effect of remittances on corruption. And for that period, I'm looking primarily from like the mid-80s onwards. So I'm excluding sort of the period before that because I don't have data for the corruption data prior to that. But for the data that I look at sort of from the mid-80s up until the same set, like 2008, 2009, we see the same basic effects. That it sort of, at least at high levels of corruption precisely because it sort of allows high levels of patronage spending,
No?
Have you found, maybe in your literature review, any like country that risk review maybe is immune to that correlation between remittances and autocracy? Maybe not in a Muslim country, but I don't know, non-Muslim country.
So I mean, sort of this paper is part of like a book project that I have on looking at how different types of international capital flows, foreign aid remittances and FDI, foster authoritarian government in countries that tend to be authoritarian already. So these capital flows come in, they're received by these dictators, and then it sort of allows them to spend on bad ways that allows them to stay in power longer. When you sort of move it into democratic countries, the results are slightly different. So remittances might lead to high levels of public spending precisely because the leaders are rewarded for sort of providing public goods. So an example of this is like Mexico, where the government has what they call a 3-by-1 program, where for every remittance dollar that the municipality gets, the government will give $3 of infrastructure projects. So it's a way of sort of encouraging the remittance income to come back into the country, but also sort of favor higher levels of public spending on public goods. So the short answer is, if you move into like non-Muslim countries if you move into countries that are more democratic, these results tend to break down and you see different types of outcomes. Right? The underlying argument is sort of that autocracies, their governments, their political institutions and their incentives are to spend their monies in different ways, right? And sort of because they're an authoritarian regime, they're rewarded for like having targeted transfer payments to individuals that support the regime. And one way that we would observe that would be through like higher public sector employment. As a result of them being able to sort of consolidate their power, they're able to sort of become a little bit less democratic. So the executive constraints will either sort of stay the same or they will become even lower.
Do you think there's like a breaking point between like, how democratic should a country be for it to be immune to that correlation?
I haven't identified the specific cut point, but in general, sort of like as So if I were, so in my other paper, if I just used the democracy's cut point, which is typically a polity score above 6, there if you do an interaction of remittances and that democracy score, we don't see the same effect on corruption. So remittances received in democratic countries has no effect on corruption. But remittances received in authoritarian countries leads to high levels of corruption. Moreover, remittances received in increasingly authoritarian countries become increasingly more corrupt, right? Sort of, that's the grim finding, unfortunately.
More questions from the audience? And anyway, I think Faisal's around, right, for
Yeah.
another like 5-10 minutes if people want to chat informally. I thank everybody very much for coming, and I thank Sada for all her work with this event and the previous one, which I wasn't here for that time. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much, Faisal,
Thank
for this.
you.
Really interesting. And,
There's coffee outside.
oh, great. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Great.